10. Mary Reid. Few women prowled the tumultuous waves during the golden age of piracy, and fewer still with the brazen skill of Mary Reid. Her defiance of fate began not in the swells of the ocean, but in the shadowed corners of her childhood. After her half-brother's untimely death, her mother, cunning and desperate, disguised Mary as a boy, a ruse that let the family cling to the meager funds trickling in from her late husband's kin. And so, dressed in breeches, she embarked on a life adrift between deception and destiny. It wasn't long before the tide swept her toward the British Navy, where she fought alongside men in battles that would have broken others. But Mary, restless and fierce, soon sought more than the rigid discipline of naval life. She became a sailor, a spirit unmoored, yet fate, with its sly smile, had more in store for her. One day, as the sea frothed beneath the stormy sky, her ship was overtaken by pirates. Whether they forced her hand or she seized the chance, none can say, but soon enough, Mary stood among their ranks, not as a prisoner, but as one of their own, a pirate. She joined the infamous crew of John Calico Jack Rackham, slipping seamlessly into the role of a man once more. Her disguise held firm, her sword sharper still. It was not just her skill at arms that set her apart, but her fearlessness, her unrelenting drive that caught the eyes of her comrades. And she was not alone in her daring. On the ship too was another legend in the making, Anne Bonny. Two women as wild as the sea itself, blazing their names into history. In time, Reid's path intertwined with that of the ship's carpenter, and between them, a brief flicker of romance sparked amid the gunpowder and salt water. But it wasn't all whispers in the night. When the carpenter found himself locked in a quarrel with another sailor, it was Reid's pistol that silenced the scuffle. She shot the troublemaker without hesitation, the smoke curling from the barrel like the faintest smile of death itself. Her end, though, came not in the glory of the fight, but in the cold grip of fate. In 1720, the British Navy, relentless and unyielding, bore down upon Calico Jack's crew. Jack himself surrendered quickly, his courage evaporating with the first crack of musket fire. But Mary fought, a lioness cornered, lashing out to the last breath. Yet even she could not stave off capture forever. The men of the crew were sentenced to the hangman's noose, and for Reid it seemed the same grim fate awaited. But life, ever a trickster, spared her for a moment longer. She was pregnant, and thus her execution delayed. She languished in prison, sick and spent, until in 1721 she succumbed to illness, her body claimed by death before the gallows could. But her name sails on, riding the winds of legend alongside Bonny, two women who dared to defy the iron grip of Britain, their memory forever entwined with the violent, untamed sea. 9. Frances Clayton. When the winds of war tore open the skies and the ground trembled with the first grim stirrings of the Civil War, Frances Clayton, with a resolve sharp as a blade, donned the trappings of a man and marched into the yawning maw of conflict. She joined the Union Army not for glory nor fame, but to fight beside her husband, her Jack, in that turbulent tempest of clashing ideals. Yet she was far from alone in her deception. The war, like some great beast, devoured men at such a pace that the hands keeping record could scarce keep count, and the army's ragged uniforms, shapeless and forgiving, granted women a strange and dangerous freedom. Hidden beneath broad coats and slouching hats, many of them slipped unnoticed into the fray, driven by their own unspoken fires. But Frances was no shadow. In the bloody crucible of battle, she proved herself not only fierce, but terrifying. Among those who fought under the banner of disguise, it was she who endured the longest, her secret clutched close until fate's cruel hand unveiled it. She was no longer Frances, but Jack Williams, a soldier with the 4th Missouri Artillery, her husband ever at her side. Through the crack and roar of musket fire, through the relentless shudder of cannon blasts, she fought in 18 battles, her body marked by wounds, her spirit hardened by the relentless march of war. But even the fiercest flame must flicker. At the Battle of Stones River, her husband fell, claimed by the merciless sweep of death that spared no one, neither lover nor friend. Soon after, her secret unraveled, her true nature laid bare to the unforgiving light of day. The army, scandalized, discharged her, yet her story could not be so easily dismissed. Her name surged through the columns of newspapers, whispered across parlors and taverns alike, and Frances became something of a legend. A woman who fought in the very heart of a man's war, a curious beacon of defiance. She gave interviews, her voice stirring the embers of her brief but brilliant notoriety. Yet after 1863, the tale of Frances Clayton took on a curious stillness, a hush like the quiet after battle. There were murmurs of her next move, hints of her considering the lecture circuit, where veterans traded their memories for coin, and such a tour might have showered her with wealth. One officer, Rand, recalled her musings on the subject in a paper out of Fort Wayne, but soon after, she vanished, disappeared, as though the battlefield itself had swallowed her whole. The world never saw Frances Clayton again, at least not by that name. And so she lingers in history, a shadow cast across the fading light of war, her fate obscured, wrapped in the mists of time. 8. The Night Witches. In the vast theater of war, where the world's fiercest men clashed in cacophonous fury, there arose a company of women whose courage was as silent and inexorable as the creeping night itself. These were the ones the Germans, with a shudder and a curse, named the Nachthexen, Night Witches. A name not whispered in jest but spoken with grim respect, for it was given to a cadre of Russian women who flew in the dark skies as part of the clandestine 588th Night Bomber Regiment, a regiment of shadows, a battalion of phantoms, where the usual laws of man's war had no place, for women, it was said, could not fight. But tell that to Marina Rasova, a woman of such indomitable spirit that even the iron-bound rules of wartime could not bind her. Raskova, with eyes that could pierce the horizon, and a will forged in the fires of the Soviet furnace, rose to the rank of major amidst a storm of disbelief. Yet she did not rise alone, for in her wake followed others, women whose hearts beat with the same defiance, who longed to fly not in the safety of daylight but under the cover of night, where the stars themselves seemed to conspire in their cause. With passion that rivaled the engines of the planes they longed to fly, Raskova persuaded the Soviet leadership, even Joseph Stalin himself, to form a division of female warriors. And thus, the first of these units was born. A squadron not of gentle ladies, but of daring night bombers, the so-called Night Witches. It was no idle title. In the deep velvet of the night, they rose like specters from forgotten legends, their biplanes slicing through the air with a strange and spectral quiet. The cleverness of their attack lay not in the thunderous roar of engines, but in the very absence of it. They would glide, engines cut to mere whispers, drifting above German encampments like the faint breath of an unseen predator. The only sound that heralded their approach was the ghostly rustling of wind against wings, an eerie swish, soft as the flapping of a crow's wing, a murmur too faint to be believed until it was too late. The Germans, unnerved by this almost supernatural silence, could neither hear nor see their doom before it was upon them. Time and again, the bombs fell like rain from invisible clouds, and by the time the Germans scrambled to retaliate, the witches had vanished into the night from whence they came. So relentless was this nocturnal torment that the Nazi soldiers, unnerved and frustrated by the sound that always came too late, named them Night Witches. And perhaps, as they huddled in the blackness, their enemies could almost believe that these women did not fly on mere planes, but on broomsticks, streaking across the sky with an eerie, swishing menace, vanishing into the gloom with their work of destruction complete. Said Mila Pavlovenko. Mila Pavlovenko, Lady Death they called her, rose from the shadowy folds of history like some fierce embodiment of vengeance, her eyes sharp as the wind that sweeps the steppes. Not for her the quiet, suffocating toil of the factory floor, nor the blood-soaked bandages of the field hospital. No, her heart beat for the kill, for the icy thrill of the hunt. And so the Soviet machine, ever hungry for steel-spined souls, set her upon the battlefield with a rifle in her hand. There, in the wild wastes of war, amidst the smoke and cries of broken men, she found her purpose. A sniper with the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division, Pavlovenko became a specter in the trees, a shadow on the ridge. Death itself bore her name, for 309 Nazi soldiers fell to her bullet, each life snuffed out with chilling precision. 300 souls and more delivered to the earth by a single, unflinching hand. It was said the enemy feared her, whispered of her as if she were some dark legend. And by the time the guns fell silent, Pavlovchenko had earned her place, not merely in rank, though she rose to lieutenant, but as the most feared woman ever to stalk the fields of war. Her story, however, does not end with the clash of rifles and the crack of distant shells. She crossed the oceans, a heroine of the Soviet Union, and found herself in the gilded halls of America, where President Roosevelt himself and his formidable wife Eleanor welcomed her with the gravity such a figure deserved. Yet, even there, among the velvet chairs and the gazes of admirers, she was met with the absurdities of a world that couldn't quite comprehend her. There were murmurings about her appearance, petty complaints about makeup, of all things, as though a painted face might somehow soothe the horrors of war she had survived. But Pavlovchenko was not one to let such trivialities pass unscathed. At a rally in Chicago, she cut through the nonsense with the same ruthless precision she had used to fell her enemies. "I am 25 years old," she said, her voice like iron in a storm, "and I have killed 309 fascist occupants by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long?" And there, in that moment, the weight of her words fell heavier than any bullet. For who could argue with her, this grim reaper in human form, this woman who had walked through the very heart of war and returned, her eyes ever sharp, her hand ever steady?
6. Manuela Sence.
Manuela Sence de Vergara y Aispuru, a name that rolls with a kind of serpentine grace, was an Ecuadorian woman who, by the most improbable of twists, became the living flame of revolution in the rugged wilds of South America. She was a figure not of gentle circumstance, but of fire and fervor, entwined with the great and tempestuous Simón Bolívar in the 19th century's thickest heat. To some, she was a symbol of defiance, a soul that burned with all the fierce beauty of a storm on the horizon. To others, she was chaos, untamable, reckless, glorious. It was not from the flames of rebellion that she first emerged, no. Her tale began in the dust and silks of a quieter ambition. In 1817, she married an English doctor, envisioning a life of society's frivolities amid the ballrooms and parlors of Lima, Peru. But fate, that cunning architect, had other designs. Revolution, with its thunderous knock, came calling, and Manuela, never one to hesitate, threw open the door. She cast aside the trappings of a fine life, as though shaking off the clinging webs of some fragile dream, and leapt into the fray, joining the great cry for independence as Spain's grip upon her colonies began to splinter. By 1822, her marriage lay in ruins, a mere shadow on her path. She had flung herself into the arms of a far more magnetic force, the cause of Bolívar, the man whose dream of freedom burned brightest in the vast and war-torn continent. For the next 8 years, she was not merely his lover, but a warrior, an ally, a whirlwind of determination, and a beacon of rebellion. Madness, some whispered, clung to her like a dark mantle. But was it not the wild spirit of revolution itself, surging through her veins? Manuela, fierce and unrelenting, donned a colonel's uniform in open defiance of propriety, a scandalous act that sent tongues wagging, yet she moved through the murmurs with her head high, her eyes bright with the fire of her convictions. And then there was the bear, her strange and shaggy companion, a creature that prowled at her side as if drawn to the wildness within her. What fear, what timidity could such a woman possess? None, it seemed. She marched to the rhythm of her own battle-hardened heart, and where she went, trouble followed. She was no idle bystander to the War of Independence. No, she led revolts with the zeal of a warrior born, stirring up chaos as one might stir a sleeping beast. And when, in the dead of night, the hand of death reached for Bolívar, it was Manuela who seized it and flung it aside. In a moment etched in the annals of legend, she saved him from certain assassination, her actions swift and decisive as any soldier's blade. Bolívar, bound to her by more than mere gratitude, named her Libertadora del Libertador, the liberator of the liberator. Yet, for all her glory, history was a fickle companion. Bolívar's death in 1830 cast a shadow upon her, and her prominence in the great revolutionary tale began to fade, as stars often do after the dawn. But time, that strange and wandering judge, has at last remembered her. Manuela Sence, the madwoman, the warrior, the liberator, has risen again in the eyes of modern historians, her fierce spirit blazing once more in the tapestry of South America's turbulent past.
5. Ena Ramirez Perez.
Let us tread now upon the uneven ground of a tale that twists through the realms of the improbable and extraordinary. Her name, unmarked by history, unburnished by fame, was Ena Ramirez Perez, a woman of no renown save for one act, so unspeakable and raw that it ripples across time like a strange and ghostly legend. The tale begins in the year 2000, in the arid depths of rural Mexico. The land itself seemed to conspire in her isolation, remote, untamed, and far from any hands that could help. It was in this desolate place that Perez, already heavy with life, felt the ominous stirrings of labor. She had no husband beside her, no doctor to summon with a flicker of modern convenience. The air hummed with solitude, and the vast sky, indifferent, spread itself above her like a silent judge. What unfolded next was not a simple birth, but a grim and terrible battle between flesh, will, and fate. For as the agonies of labor stretched into hours, she soon understood the dreadful truth. The child she carried would not be delivered by nature's hand. No, the path had closed. The door would not open. And in that realization, a decision was born that would freeze the blood of even the most iron-hearted soul. In the unspeakable grip of her own body's torment, with pain roaring through her like a wildfire, Perez resolved to take a knife, not one forged for surgery, but some blunt and unsuited blade, and perform the most primal of operations. A cesarean, not by another's hand, but her own. What madness is this? What courage, what desperation that could compel a human to such a deed? Alone, with no witness save the unforgiving walls, she pierced her own flesh. 12 hours of hell had already passed, and now the knife dug deeper, through skin and muscle, through the burning veil of agony, until she reached the unseen cradle where her child lay trapped. And still, through this tempest of pain, she persisted. She tore her own body open, and in the grip of her final strength, reached inside herself and lifted the child from its prison of blood. As the babe gasped its first breath, Perez fell into blackness, the void closing in, death perhaps beckoning, but not yet. By some slender mercy, she awoke. Her body, though ravaged, had not succumbed. The child, her child, was alive. In that moment, Perez was both mother and survivor of her own grim handiwork. And yet it was not the end. One of her young children, frantic and wide-eyed, had fled across miles to seek help, and help, slow and clumsy, finally arrived. The villagers, the health workers, they came, faces pale with disbelief, to sew her torn body back together, to bundle her away to a hospital, a far-off place where sterile lights flickered and murmuring doctors hovered over her fragile form. 8 hours they traveled, an eternity on such a brutal road, before the hospital doors yawned open, swallowing her into their care. They mended what they could, though it was her indomitable spirit, forged in the flames of that long night, that had done the greater part of the work. For against all odds, she and the infant both emerged from the dark, each whole, each untouched by death's cold hand. It was only later that the world caught wind of her tale, newspapers crackling with awe and disbelief at what she had done. And we too, now stand in that same thrall of wonder, marveling at the ferocity of her will. Ena Ramirez Perez, a name that might have been lost to the wind, had instead carved her place in the fabric of human endurance. A testament that some women are forged of iron so unbreakable that even fate must pause before them.
4. Boudica.
Boudica, the first and most fearsome of British queens. Though the very notion of Britain, like the mists that cling to the moors, was yet to take its final shape, stood tall in the shadowed folds of time. She had been bound in marriage to Prasutagus, a king of the Iceni, whose rule had flickered in the pale dawn of the 1st century, long before Rome's iron boots had stamped the island's earth. But when he died, some cruel twist of fate in the year 60 AD, the Roman vultures, ever hungry, descended without hesitation, greedy hands outstretched to seize what remained of his kingdom. They saw in his death an opportunity, but they did not reckon on the fury of Boudica. For in their invasion, in the cold efficiency of their empire, they had not only taken land. No, they had violated her daughters, defiling the sacred blood of her line, and laid hands upon Boudica herself. It was not only a kingdom the Romans sought to claim, it was her very soul. But the queen, her heart burning like the embers of a smothered fire, would not submit. With the winds of vengeance at her back and the blood of the Britons coursing through her veins, she rose against them, summoning to her side the proud and weather-beaten tribes of the island. Her rebellion was no mere act of defiance. It was a tempest that swept through the land. With the wrath of her people behind her, Boudica led them in battle, and together they struck deep into the heart of the Roman strongholds. Camulodunum, the crown jewel of the invaders' grip on the land, fell beneath her fury. The city's walls were breached, its defenders crushed as if they had been nothing more than brittle bones. The streets ran thick with the blood of the vanquished, and the sky was heavy with the smoke of ruin. It seemed, for a moment, that Rome itself might tremble before this wild, untamed force. But the gods, ever cruel in their capriciousness, did not smile long on Boudica's cause. The Roman governor, Gaius Suetonius Paulinus, a cold man with a soldier's heart, gathered the remnants of his legions and moved to meet her. On the battlefield, the armies clashed, her loyal, fierce warriors against the cold, calculating might of the Roman machine. The Romans, their discipline like steel threads woven through the chaos of war, held firm. And though Boudica's warriors fought with the desperate rage of those defending their homes, the day was not theirs to win. The earth was darkened with the blood of the Britons, their bodies strewn like broken dolls beneath a gray and pitiless sky. Tacitus, the Roman chronicler, would later write of Boudica's final act, how with defeat upon her, she and her daughters chose poison over capture, preferring the embrace of death to the humiliation of Roman chains. And though her life was snuffed out like a candle before its time, her flame did not die. For in that wild rebellion, she etched her name into the very stones of the land. To this day, her memory lingers. A queen who stood against the might of an empire, a woman who fought with the fire of 1,000 torches, and though her battle was lost, her spirit remains, woven into the legend of a land that would one day call her its own. 3 Buffalo Calf Road Woman. There is little the historians can say with certainty about Buffalo Calf Road Woman, yet what meager threads they've managed to pull from the tangled loom of time shimmer with the weight of legend. Known too as Brave Woman, though that title feels as if it barely scratches the surface of her defiance. For this was a warrior, a Northern Cheyenne heroine whose heart beat fiercely beneath the gathering clouds of the 19th century, whose hands gripped the weapons of her people in the face of the relentless American advance, and whose name became a whisper of power on the lips of those who saw her stand at the Battle of the Rosebud, and again on the blood-streaked plains of Little Bighorn. It was 1876, and the U.S. Army, in its hunger for gold, sought to tear the land from beneath the Cheyenne. But the Cheyenne did not bow meekly to this iron claw. One fateful day, amidst the silent tents along Rosebud Creek, the crack of gunfire shattered the air. The soldiers struck, sudden and swift, and in the chaos, Buffalo Calf Road Woman's brother found himself thrown to the earth. His horse felled beneath him. Death crept closer, its fingers outstretched, but she would not let it take him. With a courage so fierce it seemed to blaze from her eyes, she rode through the maelstrom, hoisted him onto her own steed, and together they flew from the jaws of doom. Yet her tale did not end there. No, just 1 week later, the skies above Little Bighorn darkened with the drums of war, and she was there again, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, side by side with her husband, the cold weight of a 6-shooter in her hand, firing into the ranks of American soldiers. On that dreadful day, the allied tribes of the Cheyenne, Lakota, and Arapaho tore Custer and his men asunder. Whispers say that it was Buffalo Calf Road Woman, along with others, who rode the final wave of fury towards Custer himself, just before the earth claimed him in that violent tempest. In the aftermath, the Cheyenne fled, scattered to the wind as hunted prey. But fate, cruel and relentless, closed its fists around them. Captured, rounded up like so many cattle, they were taken away. And there, behind the cold bars of a prison, 3 years later, Buffalo Calf Road Woman, who had once defied armies, fell to the pale hand of disease. Diphtheria snatched her breath away, but not her legacy. For though her life was brief, it blazed, a furious light in the darkness of those days when the land bled, and her people's cries for freedom echoed against the iron walls of a relentless conqueror. To Victoria Woodhall. With all due deference to the names etched more recently in the annals of history, Geraldine Ferraro, Hillary Clinton, and their kin, there is one woman whose fierce audacity surpasses them all: Victoria Woodhall. Her name, a strange whisper in the dustier corners of the past, may not ring with the clarity of modern fame, but she was the first to shatter the sky-high glass ceiling of American politics. Born in 1838, Woodhall was not content to live within the hushed confines prescribed to her. No, she was a firebrand, a creature whose veins ran with the untamed lightning of rebellion. It was in 1872, amid the smoke and simmering discontent of a nation not yet ready for such boldness, that she launched her extraordinary bid to become President of the United States. Imagine it. A woman at the very heart of a world that would have preferred her silent, dared to imagine herself at the helm. Naturally, society recoiled, shocked, aghast, its brow furrowing at the mere suggestion of this woman stepping out of the gilded prison of her place. Victory was not hers, for how could it be in a land still so deeply entangled in its prejudices? Yet Woodhall's defiance planted seeds, fierce seeds, in the soil of the suffragette movement, a movement that would rise thundering decades later. And though history may seem to have eclipsed her, the roots of that revolution trace back to her unbending will. But who was this woman, this Victoria Woodhall? The first female stockbroker to stalk the sacred halls of Wall Street, no less. A place draped in the stale arrogance of male power, and yet she stood there, as firm as stone amidst the tide of scorn. Politics in Washington, with its marble facades and crumbling morals, must have seemed but a trifle in comparison. Journalist, writer, yes, she was all these things. But more than that, Woodhall was an agitator of the highest order, shaking the very foundations of a society clinging desperately to its crumbling traditions. Her most scandalous stand was for sexual freedom, an idea so incendiary that the ink barely dried on the vicious caricatures the press hurled at her. She championed the notion of free love, that a woman should possess the same liberties of the flesh that men claimed without shame. After all, if men could dip freely into the pleasures of the world, why not women? But society did not take kindly to her demands. The political cartoons, the venomous editorials, they piled upon her with relentless cruelty. But did she bow? Did she retreat? No, Woodhall stood defiant, a solitary flame in the face of an unforgiving wind. The world today, in its craving for strong women who fight, could do with more spirits like hers, unyielding, unafraid, and utterly indifferent to the fickle sneers of the crowd. One Queen Tamaris. In the vast and windswept plains of Central Asia, where the skies press low and wide upon the earth, there lived a queen whose name, though whispered in the shadows of history, rang with a fierce, untamed power: Tamaris, Queen of the Massagete. Unlike those monarchs who came adorned with jewels and cloaked in silks, Tamaris bore her crown with the iron strength of one who had seen both love and death stripped from her in cruel succession. She was no mere sovereign. She was the fire at the heart of a nomadic tribe, masters of horses, whose steeds thundered across the land like storm clouds unbound. It was her husband's death that first thrust her into the precarious seat of power, leaving her to rule over a people known not for their civility but for their thirst for war. Alone, with the winds of violence ever at her back, she had but one choice: to take up her sword and lead. And so she did, with a defiant grace, embodying the war cry of her people. But the eyes of the great beyond had settled upon her, or rather upon the land she governed. A land coveted by none other than Cyrus the Great, the glittering lion of Persia, a man whose hunger for conquest knew no bounds. News of her widowed state reached him, and his mind, ever scheming, saw in her a prize, a queen to be bent beneath his will. But Tamaris, oh, she was no flower to be plucked, no delicate thing to be ensnared by the honeyed words of empire. When the marriage proposal arrived, its gilded words veiling the sharp edge of conquest, she cast it aside like a viper. Her people would not be swallowed by the yawning jaws of Persia. No, she would see to that. But Cyrus was not a man to be refused. His pride, stung by her rebuke, twisted into a darker resolve. With cunning befitting a king, he set a trap, luring her forces with false promises, drawing them into his grasp. The jaws of that trap closed swift and brutal, and in one fell swoop, a great part of the Massageté host was butchered, scattered like leaves in a gale. Worse still, the cruelest hand of fate reached out to pluck her son from the battlefield, casting him into the maw of captivity. It was then that Tamaris, with the fires of rage burning in her breast, penned a letter, each word a blade, each sentence a spear hurled at Cyrus's blackened heart. "Give me back my son," she demanded, "and depart unpunished from this land you dare trespass. You have spilled enough blood for now. But if you refuse, by the sun, Lord of the Massageté, I swear you shall drink your fill of it." A threat not easily dismissed, yet Cyrus, blind in his arrogance, was slow to heed it. Though in time perhaps fearing the wrath promised in her words, he did release her son. But the cruel hand of fate had one last twist. Her son, broken by the weight of his capture, took his own life, and in that moment, something inside Tamaris snapped. Not with sorrow alone, but with a vengeance that could not be sated. Grief, when joined with fury, is a weapon no man may withstand. Tamaris rode to war like the very storm she was born beneath, her warriors at her side, and she fell upon Cyrus's forces with a savagery unmatched in all the annals of war. Even Herodotus, who spoke of battles that shook the earth, could scarcely comprehend the might of her charge. The Greeks, those masters of war themselves, could only bow in reverence at her ferocity. And when the dust had settled, when the last cry had echoed into silence, there lay Cyrus. His grand ambition crumbled to dust, his body cast like refuse upon the bloodied field. Tamaris, in grim triumph, sought him out among the fallen. She found him, the great king who had sought to take all from her, and in a final act of vengeance, she severed his head from his body. With a cold, unflinching hand, she placed it in a sack, as if to say, "Here, then, is your fill of blood." Queen Tamaris, more than a queen, more than a warrior, became legend, her name etched in the marrow of history, forever entwined with the downfall of an empire. Badass indeed, but more so, a figure wreathed in myth and shadow, her story as wild and untamed as the plains over which she ruled. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel for more content. Also, don't forget to share this video with your friends. We appreciate your support. Bye.